Hello, guys, it's Carly. So, I'm going to be doing my speech to inform for y'all today. Has anybody ever been really passionate about something, maybe to the point where it got you into a little bit of trouble? Um, I have. Not going to get into it, but I have. So, this kind of describes or gives a nice introduction into what I'm going to be talking to you guys about. So, I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Weathermen organization. So, from about 1965 to 1980, they were like a militant, radical, democratic activist group that pretty much wanted to overthrow the government violently due to the Vietnam War. So, if you're not familiar with the Vietnam War, it was a terrible war. It went on for a really long time. Tons of innocent people died, innocent civilians in Vietnam. And so, this really caused a stir up in America because we were so against it and we didn't really know why. A lot of people really didn't know why we were doing what we were doing, and people just saw it as this evil act and they wanted to stop it. So they basically organized a protest kind of group called the Weathermen. And just get down here. I was first introduced to this topic when I was a senior in high school and I was taking government. I found it really interesting. We had to watch this documentary, which I watched again for the purpose of this speech, and I loved it just as much as I did the first time, which is really awesome. So, the Weathermen had a great impact on society during the Vietnam War and manifested a revolution within America. Like I said, from 1965 to 1980, the Weathermen rebelled against the American government in order to protest against the Vietnam War because it was violent, it was brutal, it was bloody, and they were willing to take a beating and, be hit a couple pegs down if it meant that they could get their point across to society. So the Weathermen group started with a group of people called the SDS, and that stands for the Students for a Democratic Society. So that was originally about a group of 13 people. They stood with the SDS at one point, but they kind of wanted to branch off and take a little bit of a different route than the SDS. So they wanted to be a little bit more rebellious, a bit more violent, a little more rough around the edges, as a means of protesting. So by the time 1969 came around, the Weathermen took the values of the SDS and made them a lot more sinister, incorporating violence, sex, drugs, and just all around rebellion of the social norms of society. And this was just kind of who they were. They wanted to be outlandish. They wanted to stand out to everybody. They didn't want to be under the umbrella of people who were kind of just standing idly by while terrible things were happening in America. And like I said, they're young kids. They're kids that are our age, late teens through their 20s. And so it was a very cultish kind of thing. They protested the U.S. government and their participation in the war. And they were also really big on civil rights, fighting against racism. And that's kind of where they got a lot of their ideas, was from the civil rights movement. But they took that peaceful protesting and they turned it into a non-peaceful protesting to get the attention of the government and to be seen by people, because they saw that, okay, these protests, these nonviolent protests, they're getting somewhere, but look how long it takes that to really be in effect. And so they took that and they did with their own idea of it. And so in the summer of 69, members of the Weathermen moved to cities around the country so they could spread their ideas and beliefs against the government. They would fight local police, perform any kind of violent act to put their political views into action. So they went to multiple cities. They built collective houses to pretty much transform these young individuals and turn them into these young radicals and turn them against the government. And so their big thing was bring the war home. And that's exactly what they planned on doing. They were going to smash windows. They bombed buildings. They fought police. Pure vandalism, because they were trying to bring that aspect of the war that was in Vietnam into the US so people could see how tragic and how terrible it was. Not that they did it in the best way, but that's what they did. Touching on the racism aspect again, they considered themselves to have very close ties with the Black Panther Party. They had neighboring buildings in the same cities, and like I said, they hated racism. They hated cops. They called them pigs. Everything you could really think of that was against our government, our social norms at that time. And a big person that played a huge part in their activism and racism was Fred Hampton, and he was an activist in the Black Panther group, and he was murdered in his sleep by police officers, and he was an innocent man. And it really struck something in the Weathermen, and they really took uprising against that and fought for him. But the Black Panther Party viewed them as violent and too extreme, and they were on more of the side of nonviolence. And here were the Weathermen pretty much taking their ideas and beliefs and putting violence behind them, and they didn't like that. Eventually, the police and the FBI, pretty much the FBI, had a wanted list out for them. Some of these people were on the FBI's most wanted list. And so these people had to go into hiding. The Weathermen had to go into hiding. And so this is when the underground movement became a thing. They left behind their family, their friends, everything they knew, so they could go into hiding, so they could keep doing these terroristic acts and not be found by the FBI. And so after this, they bombed many, many buildings. We've got here, they bombed the National Guard headquarters in response to the Kent State killings. They bombed the New York City police headquarters in response to police repression. They bombed the Presidio Army base in San Francisco to mark the 11th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. The U.S. Capitol was bombed to protest invasion of Laos. The Queen's Courthouse, in solidarity with the U.S. prison revolts, that we bombed them because of that. The New York Department of Corrections at the protests of killing 29 inmates in the Attica State Penitentiary, and it just goes on and on and on. And between 1970 and 1975, there were 14 bombings that this group had performed in America. And again, this was all to get the attention and start a revolution against our government. And this was huge because this was kind of the first time we really saw something of this. It was not necessarily its magnitude, but just something of its kind. You know, we've seen people protest, we've seen people revolt, but never in such a terroristic way. And that, I mean, you know, you could kind of look back in the civil rights movements and think, okay, well, you know, the KKK, they pretty much protested Black lives in a very terroristic way. But that was normal. That wasn't seen as something that was sinister because the white majority was okay with it. But at this time, it was young white kids who were rebelling, and people really, rebelling for, like, against and for the, people with colored skin. And they were together for the bigger picture. They were there for the right reasons, pretty much. So after a while, they were in hiding, they did these bombings, and kind of over time, the war ended in 1975, people came home, and really their main course for action was depleted. They had nothing to really revolt against anymore. And so a lot of these people who went into hiding just had to kind of stay hidden because they couldn't give up these identities that they had made for themselves. They couldn't do it. Because if they did, they would be in federal prison, probably. But eventually, around the 80s, most of them did eventually come out and turn themselves in because they were tired of living underground. So in conclusion, the Weathermen were a radical group whose motive was to end the war, racism, and any other capitalist ideas that our government was implementing that took freedom away. They wanted freedom. Um, they sided with violence to get what they wanted out of the government, but it didn't really work as well as they thought they were going to. And by 1975, the war had ended and their mission was no longer needed. They were very influential to the younger generations of their time, and I personally see a lot of similarities in some aspects of kind of the revolt and rebellion that millennials have and Gen Z has. You know, we have a lot of those similar urges to want to gain freedom, and we want to get our voices out there and be heard. And I think that that's something that our generation and these group of people, like, we have in common, a lot more common than people would think, which I think is pretty neat. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys. I hope y'all are staying safe and trying to get through this tough time. I will see y'all later.